Thank you for coming out at 6 p.m., you know, after work hours, after a full day. I'm really grateful you're all here, and I'm excited to be a guest of Arizona State. It's my first time in Arizona. I'm so excited about a different landscape. I think it's also something post-pandemic, you know, when you are sitting in the city, you see the same walls and the same streets, and here, you know, you come. I was recording a video from the balcony of my hotel saying, look at this desert. It's almost like Kazakh steppe, so much space. So I feel very much at home here and welcome. And I thank my host for the really lovely reception. So today I'll be talking about my book that just launched a few weeks ago on February 15th. And it was a very long journey. It took me 15 years to write this book, so it's a big deal that it's finally out. And Kathleen saw the last couple of years of my struggle, daily struggle, but it's out there. So the topic of my book is nuclear history of Kazakhstan, and I cover both what happened during the Soviet period when the Soviet military tested nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan, but also what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed and Kazakhstan inherited quite a bit in terms of a nuclear arsenal. And so a few years ago, I started traveling to the former nuclear testing site at Semipalatinsk, and you can see the photo. And now you can see why I feel that Arizona reminds me of the steppe, because it's also very flat. That's the actual space, the site of the former testing site. The size is incredible. It's 18,000 square kilometers. It's the size of Belgium. You can imagine they took this chunk from the land and they made the military side out of it. And so when I started traveling to the region, and especially to the rural areas near the former testing site, I began meeting survivors of nuclear tests or victims of nuclear tests. And on one of the first trips to the villages, one of the first victims I met was a 6-month baby, so just born. And he had 6 fingers on one of his hands. And the next family we visited was this one, and you can see them on this photo. This family lost one daughter at the age of 6. The older daughter you see on the photo, she had cancer and had to go through 2 years of treatment. She had facial cancer. Thanks God, she's fine now. She has some health issues, but cancer has been, like, she was able to overcome it. But her little sister standing in front of me, she's actually missing 4 fingers from one of her hands. So you can imagine, I just saw a family where the baby had 6 fingers. Then the next family I'm going to, this child is missing fingers. And I just felt so much anger, because obviously these kids were born long after the last nuclear test. This is now the 4th generation of victims in Kazakhstan. And the medical records of these 2 girls, they're this thick, and they are officially recognized by the government of Kazakhstan as victims of nuclear tests. They, you know, their medical cards would say the diagnosis would be the impact of ionizing radiation. And I just find it so unfair that these people who didn't do anything, right? The children who have nothing to do with high politics, that they are the victims. And I start my presentation on purpose with this story, so that whatever I say after about politics or diplomacy, arms control or denuclearization, that we don't lose sight that there are real humans behind nuclear weapons programs. There is no doubt that the Soviet military didn't give any thought to local communities. The documents that I was reading about how the site was chosen in Kazakhstan, everything is very technical. It's about geography, geology, whether there is sand, whether there is access to construction material, the position of the site, that there were transportation links, but they were not too close because they were worried about foreign espionage. But they called it uninhabited. And this is just not true, because the area where they put the site, it had all these settlements with thousands of people, and the land itself, just, I'm sure those of you who studied the region know that Kazakhs were very big on raising livestock, and so they needed the land to for livestock to eat, and they would be moving around the area. They would have places where they would go in summer months and places where they would go in winter months. And there were also actually settled villages all over this area, not to mention a major city of Semipalatinsk. You can see on the slide, the top left photo. Semipalatinsk is about 75 miles away from where they established the site. And back at the time, the population was already 120,000 people. So it's a major city. And with it was a very important city in terms of culture and history of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's famous writers and educators were from that region, from this area. The city itself was a major merchant town where merchants from all over Central Asia, Russia, and also Europe would gather and trade goods and also animals, and it's a diverse ecosystem. The animal you see on the photo is an antelope called saiga. It's a rare animal, and so the way we within Kazakhstan would perceive the region would be very different. It would be an important place for many reasons, and the way the Soviet military viewed it was completely different, right? And I always put nuance when people are asking me, was it genocide? Did they do it on purpose to Kazakhs? There was no purpose, let's harm Kazakh people, but there was no consideration to what will happen to the local communities. Because building and testing the bomb was more important to the Soviet government than caring about what would happen to the people. And I just wanted to give just one episode to to underscore how little thought was given to the local communities. In 1953, the Soviet scientists were ready to test their first thermonuclear device. And a thermonuclear device is much more powerful than an atomic, just a simple atomic device. And they knew that it would be extremely powerful, much more powerful than anything they tested before. And they were already, everything was ready for the test. The device was already brought into Semipalatinsk, and the plan was to drop it from a tower, I believe. Why I mentioned this is that, the closer you are to the ground, the more contamination there is. And in this case, it would be very powerful. And so nobody thought about what's going to happen with the locals. And then just one lone voice of someone from the ministry, in the Soviet Union, it was called the Ministry of Medium and Heavy Machine Making. In reality, it was the ministry responsible for the nuclear program. And so this one guy is like, wait a minute, but what about the fallout? Because it's a much more powerful device. And the military bosses they were upset. They were like, everything was going according to the plan, and this guy appears with his concerns, and now we have to think about it. But it was actually Andrei Sakharov who was the father of this thermonuclear device. And in his memoirs, he describes this episode and how they had to scramble, and they had a choice. They could either evacuate people from a pretty large area, or delay the test and come up with a different method, maybe not dropping from the tower, but from high in the atmosphere, from a plane. They were Russian, and so they decided, let's evacuate the people. And again, if you read Kazakh accounts of how the evacuation was happening, it's just imagine you live your life, you're in this village, you have your livestock, and then military appears and they say, everybody, we are evacuating you. We don't know where, we don't know for how long, and we're not going to tell you why. And so all these people in panic, they've been moved, and it's like thousands of people having to move with their livestock, crying, not knowing where they're going. But also years later, it turns out that even the place where they were moved to was not necessarily a safer place for them. And during the test, there were victims, some soldiers died. Then I don't remember whether it was after this specific test or the second thermonuclear test, but one family was hiding in a shelter. And then after the explosion, they came out, the adults came out, and the little girl was still inside the shelter playing with her little cubes, and the shelter collapsed because the wave reached. But I'm just conveying the stories that it's just one example of, I don't know, glass falling into inside of a meat producing facility in Semipalatinsk, right? And just this glass inside the meat, or windows breaking in houses and hurting people, or ceiling falling in a hospital, again, bringing injuries to people. And these are immediate injuries, not to mention the long-term consequences of ionizing radiation. But as I mentioned, it wasn't that the Soviet military, their aim was to do harm. Their aim was to produce nuclear weapons, and they just didn't care. And ethnic Kazakhs were the main victims because it was predominantly ethnic Kazakhs who lived there, and also because they were the ones who depended on the land the most, because they were the ones herding livestock and so on. But there were also all these other ethnicities, Russians, Germans from the Volga region, Koreans, Crimean Tatars, all those ethnicities who Stalin exiled years before. So it was really a kind of it was a tragedy for the entire community, not just ethnic Kazakhs. And maybe during Q&A we can discuss the parallels between the Soviet nuclear testing program and all the other testing programs, because US tested in the Marshall Islands, French tested in Algeria, Brits tested in Southern Australia where the native communities lived. So you can see certain patterns. And what hurts me as a Kazakh is how for decades the negative impact of radiation on local communities was dismissed. Everything was secret. The narrative was very tightly controlled. And so when people started getting sick, dying earlier, committing suicides, and I just don't want to go into all these details, but some of the things that the military would say would be just so disrespectful. They would say, oh, all these people are getting sick because they don't consume enough vitamin C and because their hygiene is poor. Not because radiation has anything to do with it. I wanted to share one of the testimonies. So Sarjal is one of the villages not far from the nuclear testing site, and you can read what this person had to say. And so this continued for 40 years, and it's only in the late 1980s that there was this perfect storm of events or conditions that allowed for people of Kazakhstan to stand up and push for the closure of the nuclear testing site. It was February of 1989, and there was just a regular underground nuclear test. So by then already tests in atmosphere were banned, and the tests continued underground. Underground nuclear tests were not as harmful as the ones done in atmosphere, but they were still harmful because there is venting through the cracks in the ground. And so in this case, it's 89. Those of you who studied the region, you remember that it was already Mikhail Gorbachev who was in power. He was more reform-oriented. He allowed for some political dissent, right? Perestroika, glasnost. People were starting to feel that they actually can say things. He personally wasn't interested in the arms race with the United States. But Gorbachev is one thing. The military-industrial establishment was still extremely strong, and Gorbachev wasn't strong enough to kind of to outweigh these guys. But because of this political shift in political context in the Soviet Union, when this test occurred and radioactive gases vented, one of the military officers, not the one who worked at the nuclear testing site, but there was another military town that hosted strategic bombers, and all the safety devices at that place, they sounded alarm. And so he confirmed to the local Semipalatinsk officials, he said, yes, there is contamination because our devices are showing that. And this information became public. And so against the backdrop that it was a different political context now, a famous Kazakh writer, Olja Suleimanov, appealed to people of Kazakhstan to come to the writer's house in Almaty in a few days. And you see the photo from that day. And actually, thousands of people showed up, but the hall could only hold a few hundred, and so many waited outside. And when I interviewed Suleimanov, he said, actually, on the day of the rally, he didn't yet have an idea of creating a formal anti-nuclear movement. But the emotions were so raw at that first rally that they, on the spot, they decided to establish a movement. And it's less known now, but the first name of the movement was Nevada anti-nuclear movement, because they wanted to connect to peace activists in the United States who were fighting against nuclear tests at the Nevada testing site. And it's only later that they added Semipalatinsk, and then they linked the two. But yeah, on that day in February, just a few days after that underground nuclear test, the anti-nuclear movement was established. And within days, millions joined the movement. And just to remind, it's 1989, no social media, no internet, no nothing. What they used, because at the top of this movement, there were many journalists and known literary figures. And so it spread through all these networks, and within days, they had millions of signatures of people from all over Kazakhstan who wanted to join the fight against nuclear tests. And it was the people who joined the movement, it was so reflective of the multi-ethnic fabric of Kazakhstan, of really different backgrounds and professions, from miners to writers and teachers and doctors, and it really reflected the whole of the society. And so the movement, they started organizing rallies across Kazakhstan. And for 2 years, they would be just constantly rallying, protesting. And the nice thing about the movement is that they involved international activists as well, from Russia, from Japan, from the United States, members of the tribes who lived near the Nevada testing site would come and support them, or the peace activists, the physicians against nuclear war, and so on. So all these different groups would come to Kazakhstan, and they would all rally together and inspire each other. And members of the Kazakh anti-nuclear movement would come to the US and get some of them tell all these funny stories, how they would come to the US and get tips from American peace activists about how to protest, how to do all these leaflets. And so I think there was this mutual inspiration, because those who came from the US to these rallies, then they would come back and they would say, we felt so inspired by these Kazakhs protesting in such large numbers. So it was a really, I think, beautiful moment in Kazakhstan's history. And of course, I'm focusing more on the movement, but there was a lot happening on more official level, both at the level of the local governors, at the Semipalatinsk level, but also at the level of Kazakhstan, the republic. But the official narrative in Kazakhstan is so much focused on the president signed the decree to shut down the nuclear site. And I just want to do justice to the people and to the movement, that it was really helpful for officials in Kazakhstan appointed by Moscow, right? So they were, for them, it was also, they were in a difficult spot. But they could, kind of use the movement and say, look, our people are just protesting and there is nothing we can do. And so how they talk to Moscow also changed. If in the beginning, in 1989, when it all started, it was more, you have to reduce the number of tests, you need to reduce the yield of tests. It became more and more forceful. And then finally, on August 29th of 1991, to the day, it was to the day of the first, it would be exactly how many years? So the first Soviet atomic test was August 29th, 1949, and then August 29th of 1991, you had Kazakhstan's decree, presidential decree signed, closing the nuclear testing site forever. But of course, what happened in August of 1991? Just a few days before August 29th. Huh?
Collapse of Soviet Union?
So collapse officially happened in December of 1991, but it kind of started.
Kazakh independence?
So independence also December. So, the chronology is interesting. August 19th to 21st is the attempted coup d'etat, do you remember? And so that kind of showed that the Soviet structures were fragile, right? And so that also, we shouldn't shy away from acknowledging that also helped, for Kazakhs kind of, everything was coming together. You had public outcry, you had this mass happening in Moscow, and but still, it's very powerful that formally Kazakhstan was still part of the Soviet Union, and they went for it. They signed the decree and they shut the nuclear test inside. And it would be, of course, a good story, and it is a good story. But it really pains me that even though it was shot such a long time ago, and even though it was decades since the last nuclear test, I just wanted to kind of end this part of my presentation by going back again to the people and give you one more story. Oh, sorry, I didn't show you this photo. So that's the logo of the anti-nuclear movement. And they tried to do the depiction of an elder from a Shoshone tribe and a Kazakh elder. But that's the testimony I wanted to leave you with. So this story comes, it was on one of my trips to the region. I was picked up by Dmitry. His father is an ethnic Russian from Russia, and his mother is from Semipalatinsk region. She is an ethnic Kazakh. His parents met in Russia in Novosibirsk when his mom studied there, and they had several children, one of them, Dmitry. And he's also a victim of nuclear tests. So he has a genetic disorder that made, he has some alteration to his skull, and also he doesn't have collarbones. And what it means, that's how he describes it. He works as a driver at Yandex Taxi, the equivalent of Uber. But every couple of months, his pain becomes so unbearable, he cannot even hold a spoon. And so, he's a wonderful person, very cheery, and we were having a nice conversation while he was driving me to the hotel. And then just before I was getting out, he said, "Oh, there is something else I wanted to add." And he said, "What I'm sad about is that I made a conscious decision not to have children because I'm not sure if my children would have anything, like any disease." And I just think it's such a tragedy that a person has to take such a conscious decision. But now let's move to what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. Just before we do, I really like this interpretation of Scream. It's a Kazakhstani artist, Pasha Kas, and here you can see he's doing an impression of the famous Scream painting on the remnants of the infrastructure at the former nuclear testing site in Semipalatinsk. And I think it conveys so much this lingering pain from the legacy of Soviet nuclear tests. Okay, so the Soviet Union collapses and Kazakhstan finds itself with a nuclear inheritance it didn't seek. And it had more than 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads. It had intercontinental ballistic missiles. The word intercontinental gives away their main purpose, right? Those were the missiles that could be fired and they would reach the United States. There were also heavy bombers that could carry nuclear bombs. And there were numerous nuclear facilities capable of producing nuclear material. And there were also tons of nuclear material already produced. And if I am to answer the question, how was it possible for Kazakhstan to denuclearize? And the short answer would be that how Kazakhstan wanted to be perceived and the kind of country it wanted to become, it was just starting out, right, as a country of its own. Trying to get into a nuclear club didn't match it. And it's not only about nuclear weapons, and I would say not only about nuclear weapons, and especially not about nuclear weapons. What's important is everything else, nuclear material and facilities, and I'll explain. So the weapons themselves that were located in Kazakhstan, Kazakhs did not have access to command and control. So unless there was some physical attempt to gain access, they didn't have it. Okay? And I think what's more interesting is that Kazakh leadership wasn't interested in nuclear material and facilities, because nuclear material and facilities, they fully controlled, right? And in the process of building a nuclear bomb, producing nuclear material is the most technologically challenging component. So if you have material, not that you're super close to getting a bomb, but you are in a good shape, right? And so what Kazakhstan had in terms of facilities and the material that it fully controlled could be a good foundation for an indigenous nuclear program if it ever was interested in it. So that's an important distinction, and that is why it makes it so important that Kazakhstan actually didn't see it as attractive, right? And it didn't see it as attractive, I'll explain in more detail, because it didn't match with how it wanted to be perceived. But another component of this, why it was possible, was because the international community was prepared to give Kazakhstan everything it needed. And so let's look a little bit into the conditions that made it possible. So Kazakhstan of 1991 felt extremely vulnerable security-wise. Its main worries were Russia, China, and weak and stable Central Asia neighborhood. And so that's why, why worried about Russia? For the same reasons I think we can observe now. In the early 90s, Russian nationalists were so vocal, saying stuff like Kazakhstan is an artificial state. The borders were just like drawn haphazardly. In the north, these are all areas with ethnic Russians, so it should be historically Russian territory. People including Solzhenitsyn would promote these ideas. Zhirinovsky, who was actually born in Kazakhstan, and we can call him, I don't know, a clown, a not serious person, but at the time he actually was running for president. He had following, and so all this made people in Kazakhstan, the decision makers in Kazakhstan, uneasy. With China, again, another nuclear power just to the other side, fast growing, population growing very fast. Kazakhstan not having enough people, but having a lot of territory. Some of the border disputes were not resolved yet. And then, our Central Asian neighbors who were also in a similar boat like us, dealing with all sorts of crises. And that's why Kazakhstan felt very insecure. But the decision makers understood that it's not nuclear weapons that could make it feel more secure. As I've explained, they didn't have any military value for Kazakhstan's conditions. But that's why for Kazakhstan, it was so important to receive security assurances from all the nuclear powers. That's why it was important for Kazakhstan to join the Tashkent Treaty, the collective security arrangement. That's why it was so important for Kazakhstan to sign the Budapest Memorandum along with Ukraine and Belarus. That's why it was important for Kazakhstan that the US specifically said in the Charter on Democratic Partnership signed in the early 90s that Kazakhstan's sovereignty is important and so on. And here I just want to make a point that it was important for Kazakhstan, and the international community, specifically the US, could offer it to Kazakhstan. Another thing that was extremely important to Kazakhstan was to jumpstart its economy. I remember that period, the early 90s, there was nothing in the stores, right? There was just a collapse of everything. But Kazakhstan was so rich in natural resources, but they were under the ground, right? So they understood that they need to get access as soon as possible to foreign direct investment, to foreign technology, to start getting oil from underneath the ground. And it was very clear to them that if they would start trying to push their way into a nuclear club, the doors would be closed. Nobody would come and invest into Kazakhstan when Kazakhstan would be trying, okay, we don't care, we want to become a nuclear power. Similarly with international institutions, all this access to World Bank, IMF and so on. And again, the international community, especially the US, was ready to provide it. Both to keep nuclear and to get rid of it, Kazakhstan would need money and technical expertise. And they understood that if it would be to get rid of, then this assistance would become available. So again, Kazakhstan needed something, the international community could offer it. Then importantly, domestically, so it was already very centralized decision-making in Kazakhstan. It was basically Nazarbayev and a few people around him. It wasn't like in Ukraine, where there were diverse political groups and some were pro-nuclear, some were against. In Kazakhstan, there were some nationalist movements that would be promoting the idea that Kazakhstan has to keep nuclear weapons. And even though those voices were vocal, they were not very strong. And so domestically, basically Nazarbayev could be the ultimate decision maker and people around him. And they also knew that the population would support the anti-nuclear choice because of the past, right? Because of what happened with the Soviet nuclear test. And also, I just don't want to skip on the normative aspect. It really, I don't know, it made me feel proud when I would read those transcripts and policy memos from the early 90s and how Kazakh foreign policy people would say that we care about norms, we care about the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. We don't want to be the ones to undermine it. And so I think it's really important. And as one of them said, we didn't want to become a Central Asian North Korea. And just very briefly now, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the process itself. And so the first stage was to remove warheads, missiles, and heavy bombers. And this was done by the Russian military itself. And by 95, everything was removed. But once the weapons themselves were removed, there was so much infrastructure left. You took those missiles from the silos, but those silos were built to be indestructible. They were huge, even, the door of the silo weighed, I forgot how many tons, and the Russian military had to meet a certain standard under the arms control agreements with the US in terms of the destruction, but they only met this limit, right? So for example, it said it had to be exploded up to a few meters. Specific, there are specific numbers for that, but it meant that it was all there left in a semi-destroyed way. It wasn't fully dealt with. And this is where the US came in And at the second stage, it was Kazakhstan and the US working to fully eliminate those missile silos and to make it look, it would look as the landscape as it should be. But some of this battle remains underneath. And so for me, it's this idea that the land will forever carry this aftermath of this incredible abuse that it took. There was a secret operation called Steppe to remove 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. And it was, I don't want to spoil, read the book, but just maybe an episode from this story. So basically there were 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that Kazakhstan offered to the US to remove to the US. Why it was high stakes, you could have created 20 nuclear weapons from this material. And so everything was super secret, nobody knew about it. But secret, but American huge military cargo planes had to land at Ust-Kamenogorsk airport. And so the some of the people who worked at the airport at the time, they said, those planes, of course it was a secret operation, but those planes were so loud. The entire town knew that Americans have arrived, and but it was a successful operation, and I talk quite a bit about it in my book. A lot was done to secure nuclear material, and then at the nuclear testing site, it had all those tunnels and boreholes in which nuclear tests were conducted, and they had nuclear material inside of them. So for many years, it was like 15, 70 years, in some cases, Kazakhs and Americans, in some cases, Kazakhs, Americans, and Russians, they worked together to clean all this up, to secure, and so on. And I just wanted to leave on a hopeful note. I started with something sad. I want to leave on a lighter or more meaningful note that the same site, right, where weapons were tested, that brought so much tragedy to the people of Kazakhstan, it's now used for the good. The site is used, for example, for field exercises in support of the global ban on nuclear tests. The treaty is not in force yet. We're waiting for some additional ratifications and signatures, but the monitoring system has already been developed. And so, for the system to work, you have to calibrate equipment so that when something happens, they would know whether it's a nuclear test or an earthquake. And so there are some exercises there now to help calibrate the equipment and just do the checks of how it would work in real life. So there are so many more stories I want to tell you, but I'll stop myself and I'll just say that the cover of this book, the photo for this book is of Kazakh steppe that I took on one of my last trips before submitting the manuscript. And I'm just so glad that the publisher used this photo of the beautiful Kazakh steppe that is mesmerizing. Thank you. Thank you.
Help moderate questions.
Yes, I've got the chat open.
Do you think that Russia's violation of Budapest Memorandum that started in 2015 changed Kazakhstan's trust in the memorandum?
So I'm going to give you an answer as a scholar, not as a diplomat. As a scholar and as somebody who works on nuclear policy issues and international security, I think it made tremendous harm to the norms that Budapest Memorandum was violated. that the whole point of the memorandum was that these countries who signed it respect territorial integrity and sovereignty of three countries that were giving up nuclear weapons. So while officially you wouldn't see in the official narrative in Kazakhstan, maybe discussing it a lot, I can say that, you know, it's a fact that for Kazakhstan, it was a very important document. It wasn't the only document because we also had assurances in bilateral documents with the United States. But yes, I think it's detrimental not only for the sense of security of countries like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, but also going forward. I think it just in general, any event in which trust and norms are undermined, you know, has direct implications for the trust going forward.
So I have a follow-up to that, and it's one that I've been wanting to ask you all day, because Russia violates the Budapest memorandum, but the UK and the US, but they do, right? They were signatories as well. So I guess, again, I want your answer as a scholar, not a diplomat, right? What does it mean, you know, in 2014? What does it mean right now that, you know, that these, what do these security assurances mean in this context?
So, you know, there are some scholars, especially from Ukraine, who would argue that unfortunately, legalistically, but the Budapest memorandum was not as strong, especially because it wasn't that spelled out. But as I said, for me, you know, the essence of this memorandum was that security won't be violated. See, some would say, you know, US and UK, they were not the ones to violate it because right, it's somebody else. In terms of assurances that these countries gave, they were not as strong as maybe they would have wanted. So there is nothing that would be equivalent to Article 5 of like NATO, right? That attack on one, and then we immediately go and help. So I think there is this tension, but legally speaking, there is, yeah, legally speaking, US and UK don't have an obligation to go into open, like, we will defend you mode. But there is definitely a violation from the Russian side in terms of, you know, they assured Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and they didn't live up to the expectation. But there are very interesting debates on all of this, you know, who is supposed to do what and who is obliged to do what. But to be honest, just in terms of international law, these were assurances and not guarantees. In Russian, it's the same word. In English, there is a huge difference. Assurances is weaker than guarantees.
We've got one question in the back, and then I see that there's also a question online too. So maybe the question in the back first, and then we'll go online.
I was wondering, because you had mentioned that there's a seismic test center for water set up there. If there was no continued testing at all, why would there be a monitoring group or any sort of oversight?
So there are actually a few stations. Some are seismic, some are something else. And these stations exist all over the world. There is a huge network that works in support. The treaty is called Comprehensive Test-Ban Treaty, and there is an organization in Vienna that is ready to start implementing it when it goes into force. And so, first of all, we do have a country that continues to test, and that's North Korea. And second, the whole idea is that they will be there in order to pick up whenever a potential violation happens. So it's not there because Kazakhstan ever wants to test anything or because its own testing site is working. It's there as part of this now international monitoring network.
So the next question is from Margaret Hansen, who's a professor here at ASU. She says, thank you. It was very fascinating, and congratulations again on the book that's coming out. She writes, I was wondering what government programs there are in Kazakhstan to support those still suffering from health effects from the testing. Second. Again, what government programs are there in Kazakhstan to support those suffering from health effects from the testing, and how you'd evaluate them? Sorry.
Thank you, Margaret, so much for this question. So back in 1992, Kazakhstan passed a law on victims of nuclear tests, and it set up some benefits. And it was an important law for its time, but it's completely out of date. And even though they do have some benefits, which includes free medical care, if you're considered an official victim of nuclear tests, and if your disease falls into the list of officially recognized diseases that are connected to ionizing radiation. And they have some other benefits, for example, additional paid leave if you're working in the educational system or healthcare system. But I think they are so insufficient for today. I think it's a disgrace that the law is so out of date. I'll just give you some examples of why I think Kazakhstan's government has to do something and do it urgently. For example, this guy, Dmitry, on one hand, he's recognized as a victim, but his disease is not in this list, not in this perichin. And so he's in this limbo in between. He's also not recognized as a disabled person because he's considered to be able, but okay, he's able, for most of the time, but he's also not, he's disabled when his disease flares up. And also what becomes of him when he cannot drive anymore and cannot support himself, or that family that I showed to you, that daughter, she thankfully received treatment, and she doesn't have cancer, but she has other health issues. But there is no coverage, for example, for the expenses of going to the major cities where she can get the treatment, or if a person lived all their lives near the region and received the dose of radiation, at the moment, if they move somewhere else, they lose all the benefits. And so there are people in Kazakhstan who are working towards updating the law, making social support more comprehensive. And the number one thing the villagers ask for is the return of earlier retirement. For some reason, it was lifted, and now they have to retire at the same age as everybody else in Kazakhstan. And they would say, look at our village. How many elders do you see? We don't even live up to our retirement age. We just want to retire earlier to take care of our health. And so, yes, I consider it at the moment inadequate, and I hope for good progress in this area.
She has a follow-up question. Let's see, if I could follow up, are the benefits not following when they move tied to the PISCES system? So when
exactly.
they move?
So right now, if you move outside of the areas considered to be, because there are different categories, zone of highest risk, the medium risk or something. But at the moment, if you move, you lose the benefits. But as I said, thankfully, real experts, for example, from the medical experts who work on these issues, they say really this should be adapted because your dose travels with you. You received it, that's it. You live with it forever, and that's just one of the example. Yeah, there are many other intricacies and that need to be worked out. And at this point, really, I'm really not looking, towards our northern neighbor. I really feel now that it's up to us, it's up to Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan's government and Kazakhstan society to deal with it. We need to take care of our own people.
for what steps do you think would need to be taken to denuclearize the US? And do you think it's even really possible? At this point?
Thank you. This is a great question. So on one hand, you know, the former President Obama said, we all hope for a world free of nuclear weapons, but it won't happen in my lifetime. And I think it's really difficult to work in this field because, of course, you know, I would be lying if I would say it's easy and it will happen and I'll see it. I don't think so. But I wouldn't be working in this field if I would think that it's meaningless to try to move towards it. And there are some very hopeful signs, and I'll explain. So for all this time, you know, whenever non-nuclear weapon states would complain that, you know, why do we have to do everything on export controls, comply with everything, or comply with non-proliferation? And there are those 9 countries with nuclear weapons not planning to disarm. I think the dynamics is shifting because, and if you're interested, look up Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's the treaty that went into force just recently in January of 2020. It's a UN treaty and it's already in force. And it's basically majority of countries pushed to prohibit nuclear weapons. Of course, none of the countries with nuclear weapons joined it or respected, or they're so dismissive. But I think it's really shifting these countries who before didn't have any agency or any say in like big nuclear politics that is only available to big guys, to these countries with nuclear weapons. They're now actually taking agency back and they're pushing for it. And I do feel that nuclear powers are more and more on the defensive. And so I don't think it will be fast or soon in the US. And the main problem is, everything is also about money, that there is this huge industry, right? That is the military establishment commercial complex, and it's really hard to take them on. But I think there is movement in the right direction. So maybe not soon, but it is possible. And also, if you're interested in some of the more advocacy work that is happening in this area, look up ICAN. It's International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and they just have resources on how to get involved. And they're the ones who are very good with sending an optimistic message that actually it's in your power to do something. Thank you for this question.
Yeah, I noticed that the US was very conspicuously absent from the map of the TPNW countries, so.
Yes.
I have a question. I saw that in some of your slides, you talked about interaction between Americans and Kazakhs. And I know there were pairings between nuclear cities in the US and former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know, in continuing into present day, is there back and forth on best practices and way to continue the advocacy for continued healthcare, job support, all of those type of things that some of these cities are still dealing with?
So there is cooperation between the US and Kazakhstan on nuclear security issues, not as much on the kind of more social. So that cooperation goes on. It's not as intensive as before because there are fewer, specific security or military issues to work on. But your question reminds me, and maybe it will be interesting for the audience, of all the cooperation that was happening between the United States and Russia. There was, for example, an initiative called Nuclear Cities Initiative, and it was specifically the US funding and assistance towards formally closed nuclear cities in Russia to help the scientists with this very sensitive knowledge to work on peaceful scientific projects. And there were all these good programs in place. You know, they had their problems, but overall, there was so much happening in terms of the US and Russia, and everything stopped over the last few years. And it's very unfortunate, but maybe one day there will be return. But there were some really amazing projects exactly on that, more on the US-Russia side. Yes?
How likely do you think it is, or not likely at all, that the events that have unfolded in the last couple of weeks in Ukraine, does that increase the chances, or to put this another way, how likely do you think in the next half century, that there will be more nuclear weapon states, that more countries will look to see what's happening, not just in Russia, but as people are more concerned around the world with perceived, instability and stuff, that people will think that this is worth maybe the, like what you were talking about with Kazakhstan, sort of the norms, right? The international prestige, that it's worth sacrificing that if they can believe that their state security is guaranteed.
I actually think that the answer is no. Or maybe I'm hopeful that the answer is no. I think the history shows that we didn't see as much proliferation as everybody was worried about. We still have 9 countries in the world with nuclear weapons programs. Of course, there are concerns about, what will happen in the Middle East and so on. And there are countries that are very advanced with their peaceful nuclear programs that they can be considered latent nuclear states. But I think that starting a nuclear program, it comes, if you're not the original 5 nuclear weapon state under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it just comes with such immense costs, both in real terms, but also political costs. And what's the utility? We are looking at the conflict now, right? And nuclear weapons create this extra risk, but they are not of any practical utility in the conflict. And I think it's also a question of what kind of conflicts and insecurities the countries will be thinking about. And I just don't think nuclear weapons are the best investment. So, of course, we worry that, the same groups in the US would start saying, oh, we need even more weapons, even though the US and Russia already have enough to kill the planet several times over. I hope that the push from everybody else that, look, what's happening, we have a conventional conflict, but because there are nuclear weapons, we are sitting here and being so afraid. Wouldn't it be better, of course it would be better if there wouldn't be a war at all, but that the presence of nuclear weapons creates such unbearable risks that I just hope that there will be a greater push to reduce nuclear weapons instead of new countries thinking, oh, let's build nuclear weapons because we have nothing better to do. I cannot guarantee this, but I hope that's how it will be developing. Yes?
I have like a 2-parter, so I'll try to condense it. So first, I was wondering if, even though there are 2 weapons, launch systems have grown.
Do you mind to speak up a bit?
I was wondering if launch systems are stronger, and I don't.
It's going to help for us all to hear what you're saying.
Okay.
I was wondering if launch systems have grown in, I guess, capacity to the extent where perhaps we don't need that many nuclear weapons in a regular missile, or maybe warheads are more translatable and whatnot, other things. But equally, I was wondering if there are weapons outside of nuclear weapons that are maybe have similar radiative effects that are being made in physics laboratories across the world that are equally causing countries to move away from nuclear weapons already, because you see a massive reduction with the New START line. The State Department has this up, right? So I was wondering if that was like a thing that you might know about?
So the reduction in strategic nuclear weapons, it's happening more out of realization that they just like, there is a diminishing return. They just truly don't need as many, right? I want to compare it to money, but maybe, you know, for example, I consider that above a certain income, it just doesn't make any difference anymore. It's useless. But maybe it's just me, you know, working in this field, right? We're not here for the money. But it's a little bit similar with nuclear weapons that why would you need to keep and maintain this enormous arsenal if you already have, like, why don't you just have enough to ensure that you can have a second strike, that even if you're attacked, you know that even if some of your weapons are destroyed, that you can also destroy the other side. So I feel the push for arms control and reduction really comes more because of that, just because they truly have too much. But you're raising a good point in terms of this, first of all, the blurring between high capacity conventional weapons, but also, you know, cyber wars and everything. You have this maybe tension or almost an existential question, right? That where is this line? And if you have such powerful conventional weapons or other types of weapons, why would you need nuclear weapons? But it seems that no matter what nuclear weapons stand in the category of their own, they just have this something about them, right? In the psyche of the world, I don't know, society, that it's just a weapon of its own kind. And I see this probably more in terms of blurring that the risks of escalation, I think, become more and more pronounced because you have this high capacity conventional weapons. And so, you know, in the nuclear doctrines now, we see that they say we can attack with nuclear weapons, not only if you attack us with nuclear weapons, but if there is existential risk to us. And that can mean that it can be a huge, you know, some other weapons or some other attacks. So there is a lot of gray in this. And some might say, yeah, if you have all these powerful new weapons, maybe you should not have nuclear weapons. But yeah, as I said, some are still clinging to them very much.
Probably have time for one more question.
So I know you said like prior to Kazakhstan. So you said that prior to Kazakhstan denuclear or giving up their nuclear arsenal, there had still been like a small but vocal group of people who were against that.
Yes.
How has that group of people kind of evolved? Is there still a group of people in Kazakhstan currently, and especially given the recent events of the past couple of weeks, has that kind of given them more of a voice?
Thank you. So those groups, or even sometimes even individual scholars or historians, in my book, I just give as an example one historian who was making actually good points, you know, to the normative question I was telling you. He was, for example, saying nobody thinks that France is an uncivilized country, right? In France. So he was making some good points, and so they were given voice and they were vocal, but as I've mentioned, they didn't have much political power. And then, you know, after it was all done, it kind of subsided to zero. What sometimes happens is more on social media, but now it's not some like even political actors or serious people with some say, I would say, that there are just those, I don't know. I get on Twitter some random comments from, sometimes I don't even know if they're real people, but they would just throw out something, but it would be so uninformed and they would be specifically addressing Soviet nuclear weapons. But as I mentioned, there is a lot of nuance, and it's more interesting the material and infrastructure rather than the weapons. And so you still have it, and it did intensify a little bit even before the war. We had also, I think, whenever there is any flare up, just in general. For example, in January we had peaceful protests in Kazakhstan, and then they were hijacked by some violence, and they were very anti-first president. There were political slogans that were very anti-first president. So under that umbrella, people started saying, oh, and why did he give up our nuclear weapons? He shouldn't have. But again, these are now not some politically inclined people, but just some voices on Twitter from, I don't even know who these people are. So it's not a part of the proper discourse within the country. It's not part of a serious discourse. I think it's much more, within the Ukraine context, I see that there it's really on a high level that you have some of these discussions. And that gives me a chance to advertise a book that is coming out exactly on Ukraine on this issue in a few months. It's called Inheriting the Bomb, Ukraine's Nuclear Disarmament by Mariana Bujerin. So look it up. It's already available for pre-order.
Such a generous thing to do to promote a colleague's book on a topic that, of course, is
it's so timely, and I just highly recommend it, especially with everything that is happening now and all the takes. I think, I'll just maybe mention for this, you are students and scholars, and I think it's our responsibility to engage in an informed debate. And it really pains me when I see just random takes on Twitter. Maybe I should spend less time on Twitter, but I really want everybody to say, buy the goddamn book of Mariana and read about all the complexities and nuance, and don't put stupid things on Twitter. So I think it just applies beyond Ukraine to every subject. But thank you. You've been a wonderful audience, and thank you for having me.